help regain this connectivity. However, even though corridors have been used in many conservation guidelines and reserve designs, the authors, the concern of the authors is that the ability of biological corridors to ameliorate high local extinction rates remains controversial, because they state that the evidence so far, at least up to that time, is inadequate. So, and the problem comes even from the concept of corridors, because it's a little bit controversial sometimes, or contradictory. Because, for example, for these landscape ecologists, corridors are defined as narrow strips of land which differ from the matrix that is surrounding the corridor. So the matrix is the environment, that is not the corridor. And the corridor connect a patch, somewhat of similar vegetation, but they focus on the shape of the corridors as narrow strips of land. This other concept, for example, that is used in literature is that corridors are narrow patches of vegetation that facilitate movement among habitat patches. So they are focusing more on the function of corridors, but they share the common characteristic of this, that they are narrow patches or linear patches. But these linear patches or narrow patches cannot only be corridors, they can also be used by animals as habitats. And actually, in most of the cases, the linear patches are used as habitats and not as corridors. So it's important to understand the corridor function, what a corridor is, and to differentiate it from what a habitat is. So the corridor is a linear landscape element that provides for movement between habitat patches, but not necessarily reproduction. So the organism or the species cannot do all life story requirements or fulfill all life story requirements in a corridor. In contrast, a habitat provides resources needed for survivorship, reproduction, and movement. So the animals can also be moving in a habitat, but they can also reproduce there. Even though habitats or corridors might be similar. So for example, a riverine or riparian line along a river can be habitat for some species, and corridor for others. And these green belts in city or urban green belts can be both, or each of them, so it's really important to differentiate. So now that we conceptualize them, we can start with the corridor function. So the main goal of a corridor is to reduce or help mitigate this regional or local or global extinction. And how? By allowing continued exchange of individuals among a previously connected population to increase population persistence. So that's the main goal. And they should do it through a series of mechanisms. So at the population level, by decreasing variability in birth and death rates of population, by increasing colonization or recolonization rates of unoccupied patches or previously occupied, decreasing in breeding depression, increasing potentially adaptive genetic variants for maintaining population fitness, and also at the individual level, but by facilitating movement within its home range. And actually, this mechanism at the individual level is less studied, the author states that, but it's really important, and the population level mechanisms are really dependent on this individual level, especially for populations where the home range of each individual is bigger than the patches that have to be connected. For example, these tropical species like tapir and jaguar, that sometimes they really need this connectivity through corridors to achieve their normal home ranges. And a population is composed by just a few individuals. Or for migratory species, like this amphibian, that they give us an example, that has to move for another life stage to a different habitat. So they depend on the connectivity to do it. So to understand and to know that corridors are functioning and that there is movement of individuals, scientists have tried to do it by many research and studies, but the evidence from some observational studies might be inadequate, and they give several examples. And one of the main ones is this paper that is the base of many other studies that came after that one. And it's, for example, that these researchers had an isolated patch and two connected patches of vegetation through what they call the corridor. So they only checked for the number of individuals and the number of species, and because they realized that the connected patches had more species than the isolated patch, and that the species that were in the connected patches were similar, and they saw these species also in the what they call corridor, they concluded that these species were used in the corridor, and the corridor was helping them to have this biodiversity. But they didn't measure actually the movement, so this is one of the problems of several studies. And also they had lack of replication. And of course, even if some studies have measured the movement, they never measured the movement through the matrix. So even if you see animals going through a corridor, you don't know if they are using more the rest of the environment unless you measure it. So those are some problems, and there are some studies that did measure the movement through the corridor. So this rodent, Peromyscus leucopus, prefers fence rows, and they select for going through the fence rows to move. Also these ground squirrels with the linear patches, and these Cynomos ludovicianus, they are some examples that do use corridors. But the researchers have never measured what happened when these corridors are absent. So they don't know if the species won't be able to move or will move through the matrix, because they see that even though they prefer the corridor, sometimes they move through the environment. And that is why the authors of this paper say the importance of experimental studies to measure all these parameters that you have to take into account. And one example was this first study with this other rodent, the vole. So they set some plots, and as you can see, the plots were, or the design was two patches that were not connected. So they are surrounded, these whitey things are what the researchers consider a non-usable environment, or not adequate environment for these organisms. So they were supposing that the organism, if they don't have a corridor, they couldn't move through these white parts. But so they set two isolated patches and patches with different width of corridors. But the animals actually were using more the white parts that were unsuitable habitat than the corridors to move. But because the authors found that the densities were higher in the patches that were connected to each other, they concluded that corridors helped. But one possible explanation the authors of this paper said that is because the habitat was bigger. So they were using this piece of corridor as extra or additional habitat and not necessarily as corridor, because the species might have like a small home range. Another experiment with salamanders was to see if they choose indeed a corridor among different pathways that they have as options. For example, here they remove vegetation of some pathways and they leave some vegetation or a corridor in the middle. And this is the patch where salamanders were. They were expecting salamanders to go to a next patch. And actually they discovered that they did choose for corridors, they did prefer corridors, but the ones that unfortunately chose the more unsuitable habitat, they compensated the movement by speed, so they were going faster through it. So that is why the rates of reaching the other patch were similar. So because through the corridor they were just slow or staying or wandering or many other things, and through the unsuitable habitat they can move and they go faster. So they prefer corridors, but they go. Another example is with butterflies. So in these butterflies that need open habitat, actually the unsuitable environment will be the pine forest. And because they had these blocks with corridors of different lengths connected, without vegetation, that's the habitat or the patches that the butterflies wanted to reach. So in this, the authors also saw that it was the rates of reaching the patch or the speckled or gold patch were higher through the corridors, but the matrix was also able to allow butterflies to move, so it was not completely unsuitable. So from these studies, there comes some common principles and patterns. For example, the first, the pathways that include components of their habitat. The pathways. The pathways that they prefer should include some component, or they prefer pathways that include components of their habitat, but they are not adverse to move through the matrix in most of the cases, so they can also move. And the relative use of this matrix depend on the degree of which it contrasted with the patch habitat. So if the matrix is similar to the patches or the habitat, they will go more often through the matrix and not necessarily using the corridors. And then when the compensatory behavior is in less favorable environments, as the speed, as I mentioned to you before, for example, going faster or making different adaptations when they have to go through a non-corridor pathway. So this generates like a model to understand this, and here you can see that in low quality matrix, the chances for selecting corridors are higher because the organisms select the corridor by this survival possibility that they have. So if it contrasts more with the matrix, they will prefer the corridor, so that the chance of finding and selecting the corridor is presented by the size of the circles. And they will go slower on a high quality matrix, high quality corridor than in a moderate quality corridor. So the speed is presented by the rows. So here they will go slower than here, like the salamanders. And in a high quality matrix, the chances of preferring the corridor are reduced. Finding and preferring the corridor are reduced. As you can see, the circles are smaller. And also the speed is reduced, and they will go still faster in the less quality corridor than in the high quality corridor. So basically at the end of all these studies that they review, they consider that there's a compromising connectivity and patch size. For example, because some organisms, or most of them, are able to use the matrix, maybe instead of giving more area to the proposed corridors, they could make the matrix more accessible to organisms, and they could use more area.
13.
They could use more area for the patch size, or even though. Okay, and even though patches are not connected, if they are bigger, they need less connectivity because they can sustain more healthy populations inside each patch, and they only need few individuals to go from one patch to another, so they don't need that really high level of connectivity. So this is really important to consider when you are designing a reserve, for example. So these are the conclusions of the paper. That I consider important is that linear patches have often been equated with biological corridors, but in fact linear patches serve different functions as a movement pathway and as a habitat, as we said before, for resident animals. Then evaluation of corridors, of the corridor function of linear patches should induce the 3 stages of successful dispersal to a target patch through a corridor. So finding the corridor, selecting the corridor, and moving successfully through it. So, Then the value of corridors as landscape connectors may be dynamic, reflecting variation in the degree of contrast between patch and matrix environments. So it depends on the contrast of both elements, as we saw from the evidence. And because of organisms respond in species and landscape specific ways to potential corridors, no single study is likely to provide a definitive answer to the question of the ecological function of linear patches, as in most cases in ecology that you have to do species-specific studies. Research of the efficacy of corridors will be most productive if conservation biologists and land managers focus on how corridor selectivity, survival costs, and movement rates of individuals vary among species with divergent evolutionary and life histories in the conditions that are likely to persist in landscape. So it's really important to test this in reality, not only in small experiments, in small scale, but in really landscape scale. Because of the lack of strong empirical data supporting the biological function of corridors, and because even if linear patches do have this function, they do not necessarily compensate for the additional habitat loss and fragmentation, caution is necessary when incorporating corridors into reserve design. So this is what the authors really state in the paper. And if large reserves are compromised in size to allow for linear patches, regardless of whether they function as corridors or simply as habitat, then their establishment might represent even a net loss to biodiversity protection. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Virna. Okay, so then we can discuss, considering the feedback rules, first the content of asking questions, and later give feedback to how Virna presented it to us.
Mm-hmm. Why did you need to, on the corridors versus patch, why did you need to write so much? Because you clearly dominate the content, but you needed to write a lot. Why did you feel the need to do so?
This slide?
In this slide, yeah. In the first, yes.
Because I wanted to give the different examples of concepts that are mentioned in literature for corridors. So you can also, you are able to read and see the difference in what the author's words. So yeah, it's for you to show the different concepts, but yeah.
Okay.
Maybe if you feel that it's too much text.
No, that's later.
And it's good to
This
reduce
is the
it.
second part of.
Yeah.
I should.
I thought it was, yeah.
With, I think it was the slide number 9 when you showed a couple of different studies. Was that was that from this paper or was that external studies? Because
they reviewed these studies.
So they
from the
reviewed
same
okay.
paper.
Okay.
So yeah.
So that's not what these guys have done.
No.
Okay.
No. Different authors. So I wrote down the name of the authors and.
It's a review paper, and those examples
Review
are
paper,
reviewed
yeah.
in the paper, which
Yeah.
was from '97 then, because she said 7.
1997. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think she said 79 or not. No, 97. Okay, I mixed it up.
So almost 10 years ago.
Yeah. Neil?
No questions.
How many papers have been analyzed, and were these papers from giving a global overview in the review?
Yeah, I think they
process?
analyzed many. For example, from this point that they reviewed many that were similar to this, or where the authors were concluding that corridors are used, even though they didn't have the adequate evidence. So they